Well, I think we should begin. If people are here and Howard has got up so early on his Sunday morning to speak to us, I think it's only polite. Now, he can't see you, ladies and gentlemen, tragically, so you need to make a lot of noise, a lot of appreciative, enthusiastic, excitable noise. So that's it. So you can picture the adoring crowd that is here thronging to hear you and see you, Howard. And before we begin, I wanted to give you a heads up that we're recording this conversation for broadcast on ABC Conversations. So an extra special reason to turn off your phones, an extra special reason to laugh loudly, cheer uproariously, clap, stamp, and all of the rest of it. Are you settled comfortably, Mr. Jacobson?
Well, I was, but when you said turn off your phones, I suddenly thought, had I turned off my phone? My joke used to be that if the phone rang during an event, it was my mother calling, but alas, that's not possible anymore, so I can't make that
Well, it's
joke.
got a more sort of supernatural tone to it if it's your mother calling.
It has. Well, I can't see my phone, but I just assume that if it rings, what have I done with it? This won't go on much longer. No, let's just assume it won't ring because it's too early for it to ring, unless you ring me.
That's right. And if it rings this early, it must be an emergency and you probably should answer it, I suppose. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that this event is being held on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to the original storytellers of this country, past and present. I am delighted to welcome Howard Jacobson to Melbourne Jewish Book Week. Howard lived here in Melbourne back in the early 1970s. It's a place where he nearly wrote a novel. Melbourne was not unique in this regard, however. Part of what's revealed in this wonderful memoir, Mother's Boy, is the lengths that Howard went to in various parts of the world to avoid doing the thing he wanted to do most, write stories. Luckily for all of us, and for him, he finally managed it. Not once, not twice, but 13 times. And of course, he won the Booker Prize for one of those novels, The Finkler Question. Hello, Howard.
Hello. Can I just correct you without being pedantic? 16 novels.
16 novels, my apologies.
And 7 works of non-fiction.
Far be it from me to denigrate the output.
And thousands of columns and works of journalism.
Thank you. It's true. It took time, though, and that's what we'll get to. We're looking at the early years, the difficult early years in this conversation. But let's treat this good audience who are sitting here so well behaved and gazing up adoringly at you with the opening section of your book.
Okay. My mother died today. It is the 3rd of May, 2020. She is 97 years old. I have had premonitions of her dying for the last 70 of those years, on occasions hearing her calling my name in the night. But last night she was silent, and today she crept under the radar of my forebodings. Many are succumbing to COVID-19, but my mother hasn't died of any virus. 2 days ago, she complained of a bad pain in her head and fell almost immediately into unconsciousness. My sister, who lives with her, and her daughter, who lives round the corner, were quickly by her bedside. My brother and I are locked down in Portishead and London, respectively, and have been unable to get to Manchester to see her. Quietly and unobtrusively, she drifts out of the world altogether. This was always the chosen way of going, without fuss or notice. I don't know whether she'd have wanted us to be with her anyway. Given her bodily compunctions, probably not. But she definitely would not have wanted us to take any risks getting there. I am upset that the pain she complained of was in her head. She feared for her head. I too, when I was small, feared for her head. As a young woman, she suffered migraines so badly that when she went to bed with her hands over her eyes, I was afraid she would not survive the night. Ours was a mental relationship. It was our heads that joined us. I dread dying with the pain in mine. We'd spoken on the phone a few days before she died, and but for my having to repeat everything I said twice, 3 times, if it was a joke, we'd had a good conversation. At the beginning of the year, when the virus was first mentioned, she had expressed surprise I was taking elaborate precautions. "Oh, Howard, you aren't worrying about that, are you?" As though she hadn't schooled me to prepare for eventualities undreamed of by the most depressed dystopians. The day I left home to go to university, she'd reminded me to take enough toilet paper. "What, for 3 years? Until you settle in." "I think Cambridge will have toilet paper," I said, but I took a roll just in case. Yet now that we really did have to contend with a calamity equal to her anxieties, she had turned perversely carefree. "Oh, Howard." By the time of our final conversation, however, she had rethought and was back to her old apocalyptic self. "It's going to kill us all," she said. "Going to kill us all," after which she moved on seamlessly to cheese. I'd been sending her gifts of mature cheddar cheese because we all love mature cheddar cheese in our family, ideally grilled on toast, and because she can't eat chocolates and doesn't care for flowers. And this cheddar cheese grills especially well. "But I don't want you to send a fortune on me anymore," she said. "It must be costing you the earth." I told her I could afford the cheese. Her reasoning wasn't always easy to follow, but I thought I could see what led her to ask next how my book was going. "It's okay. What is it again?" "A memoir." "What's it about?" "Me, Ma, what do you think?" She sounded concerned. "Is that a good idea?" "Probably not." "What about you?" "About how I became a writer." "You were always a writer." "I know, but I was 40 before I wrote anything." "You couldn't have been." "Well, I was." "Well, I don't believe that." "Well, it's true." "So what was stopping you?" That's one of the questions I'm asking in my memoir. But the short answer is being Jewish. Being Jewish? Oh, you aren't going to be horrible about that, are you? I hope not. After all, if it was being Jewish that held me back, it was being Jewish that got me going. I have said her reasoning took unexpected turns, but what she said next soared into the realms of the fantastical. She told me she loved me. I'm ashamed to say I roared with laughter. "Ma," I said, "that's not the kind of thing we say to each other." And it wasn't. Love talk was not us. "Well, I do love you," she said. I should have known then that she was dying. I'd laughed, but I was overwhelmed by feelings I didn't recognize. "I'm glad," I said, then plunged into the deep, dark chambers of the hitherto unexpressed. Because I love you. There. Said it. She, nearly 100, I in my 70s, and we'd finally said that we loved each other. It astonishes me. What? That we'd said it, or that it had taken so long? Both.
Howard, in that initial chapter, Howard, you introduce us to baby Howard Jacobson. You were born in 1942. Where?
I was born in a nursing home in Cheshire, which is south of Manchester, rather middle class, upper. That's where when Jews go to Cheshire, they change their name to St. John Christian Stevens, and buy a horse and wear boots, and don't ever remember they were once Jewish. I was born there because the bombs were dropping on Manchester. More bombs than you've ever seen, according to my mother, were dropping on Manchester. So she'd been moved out into the country, and I was born in the country. So I am, in a sense, a country boy.
Were you a happy baby, Howard?
No, I've never happy anything. Happy is not what I do. Happy is not my style or our family style. My father's style, but it wasn't my mother's style. And it wasn't my style when I was with my mother, or her style when she was with me. Sometimes I saw her happy when she didn't know I was looking, and I felt very jealous that other people had been able to make her happy, but it was not. No, I was a very unhappy baby. As I recall, I was a very unhappy baby, very uncomfortable in my body as a baby. I didn't like my body as a baby. I thought it was a silly thing to have a baby's body. And I didn't like the way they dressed me either in those kind of... What I recall is being very uncomfortable in things that they then called romper suits. I don't know whether they have a thing called a romper suit now. But the idea that I would ever do anything like romp had an inbuilt absurdity, which I knew even in my early months. And this romper suit was all metal studs. And wherever you rolled, because as a baby, you roll around a lot trying to get comfortable. Very hard to get comfortable in the... You've been comfortable where you've been, and now you're in a world and you're uncomfortable, and you're rolling around, and there are these studs pressing into your plump little body all the time. So no, I was uncomfortable and unhappy and wanted to be somebody else and be somewhere else.
It was you, your parents, and then 4 years later, your little brother and then a sister at home. Was it a noisy home?
It was the noisiest home you can possibly imagine. It was not my mother that made noise, it was my father that made noise when he was at home. In the early days, he was not at home a lot because he was working hard and driving a truck and all sorts of things. But when he was home, it was noisy. He was a magician, and not a very good magician, but a magician. So there were always tricks. There was the paraphernalia of tricks, the sound of tricks going off. He didn't know the difference between a trick and a toy. So for him, a trick was also a jack-in-the-box or a mechanical rabbit or things that you wound up. So there were things walking across our floor that you thought looked like a nursery, and anybody who came in would have said, God, what a happy household this. There must be hundreds of children. In fact, the only real child in our house was my father, and he had all these toys. So his toys were going off. And then, although my mother was quiet when she did speak, she spoke in a very expostulatory manner. So it was, oh, everything was, oh, you'll never know what's happened. And then, and the other thing that made noise was the sound of supper. My mother had no idea how to cook. And what she did to cook was she put pans of beans and soup, tins of beans and soup in a pan, forgot she'd put them there. She didn't empty them, she just put them in the pan. The tin unopened in the pan. The pan would boil dry, and we'd hear this strange rattling sound. For years, we could never work out this rattling sound, but it was the same rattling sound every night of a tin overheating in a dried up pan. And then occasionally the tin would explode, and the beans or the spaghetti hoops or the soup would go up onto the ceiling. The last time I was in the house that my mother and father had lived in, there were still stains of, they weren't living in filth, you understand. They were living in quite nice condition, but there were still signs of where the beans had exploded on the kitchen ceiling.
So not a quiet house, but your mother was a reader. What kind of reader was she, and what kind of introduction to books did she give to you?
Yeah, she was the best kind. She was a self-taught reader. She'd left school at 14, as many women, certainly most Jewish women at that time had. The families didn't have the money for them to go on. There wasn't a tradition for them to go on and go to university, not even to stay on at school. At 14, she was out of school, had a job working in a milliner's, collecting money for the Jewish hospital in Manchester, but she just picked up books that she liked. And she read a lot of kind of middle-brow writers like A.J. Cronin and Neville Shute and Somerset Maugham, people like, but also the good stuff she read off her own. Dickens and George Eliot introduced me to them. But she also loved poetry, particularly narrative poetry. And she used to read me things like The Forsaken Murmur and the Merman and the Scholar Gypsy and Wordsworth poems. And we would sit in the evening with me by her legs, as I remember it. If you think this is bathed in nostalgia, of course it's bathed in nostalgia. And she would read me poems and get me to read poems along with her. And I associate to this day this poetry with my mother. I hear all poetry in my mother's voice. Just as Wordsworth used to say, he would hear the rivers of the part of the country he was born, that they stayed in his life, and he associated the sound of those rivers, the brooks, the streams, and so on, with the important moments in his emotional life. So I did with my mother. Her voice, what she did was she conferred affection, the holiness of the heart's affection upon words and upon literature. And that might be why I was so desperate to be, I'm sure that was why I was so desperate to be a writer and felt I was destined to be a writer.
How did your mother's love of poetry win your family a television?
The Manchester Evening News ran a competition in something like 1951 or 52. And the prize was, you had to finish off a line of poetry, and the prize, if you won, was a television. And my mother, I can't remember what the opening line was, but her winning line was, a beam, see, I still recall it, a beam to enlighten our way. Clever, you see, beam to enlighten, to cast light, but also to educate. They thought this was great. We all went along to a great big hall, and we were awarded a TV, which was presented to us by very eminent television producers of the time.
You mentioned that your father was a magician, along with many other trades. Tell me about Cheap Johnny, which was one of his professional exploits. What was that? We
made at one point our first move. When I was, I suppose, I don't know what, 9 or 10 maybe, there was a great move. You must have the equivalent of this in Melbourne. At one time I would have known exactly what the topography of that Jewish move was. The great trek out across the sea, and the sea's part, and you were allowed to pass. And in Manchester, we all went north. The idea was to go north and eventually end up in Scotland, where we could change our name to those of Highland chiefs. And nobody would know we were Jewish. We got as far as Prestwich, where there were golf clubs and things, and green fields. And in a new house in Prestwich, we had neighbours, one of whom had a market stall. And my father used to drive for them, a lorry from Manchester to London, to collect stuff, junk, swag we called it. Awful cheap stuff, made in Hong Kong and Romania and places. No disrespect to those places. And my dad did that for a few years, wore himself out doing it, actually. And eventually the guy he was doing this for got fed up. He didn't get fed up. What he did is he expanded. And he didn't want to run the market stall anymore, and he gave it to my father. And the guy who gave it to my father had been called Cheap Johnny. And my father took over that name, and my father became Cheap Johnny and became a market man. He was a very good market man in the sense that he had a good personality, could do all that mock auction stuff, lady over here and a lady over there, could do all that very well. What he couldn't do was work out the finances of being a businessman. So he would buy things at one price and sell them for less. And we'd be delighted when he sold out. He would come home and he'd go, sold out today. My mother would look at the books and said, there's no point in selling out if what you're selling is cheaper than what you bought it for. He never, ever fully grasped that economic principle. So when people talk to me about Jews and money and Jews being good business people, I tell them that is absolutely not my experience of being.
What was your role in Cheap Johnny when you'd accompany your dad? What kind of market man was the young Howard?
Market man gets it. Market boy. I was the stooge. My father built a kind of stage. His van opened up onto a kind of stage, and he sold from the van, and I was down below. So he would address the crowd, and he got good crowds because he had a good, lively, vitalistic personality. He had good crowds. And he would address people. The trick of the market thing is you pretend that people want the goods at a certain price before you knock that price down to about a quarter. So we'd go, a lady over there, and he'd say to me, and he'd call me Charlie or something like that. And I hated it, and I was shy. I was embarrassed, and I thought people were looking at me. No one had the slightest interest in me, but I thought that's all that they could see, this shy little boy who couldn't do anything. very well, and still imagined himself in a romper suit with metal studs. And he would, my job was to go to the back of the crowd with an object, which a pretend person had said that they would spend £25 for, when in fact it was going to come down to about 2 shillings when it was all over. And I'd go to the back of the crowd and he'd go, Charlie, come back. No, I'm not selling at that. I'm not selling it at that. So not £25, not £20. So I was carrying things out to non-existent people at the back of the crowd and then having to bring them back hidden sometimes under my shirt or under my cardigan, and the whole time feeling a twerp. And sometimes when my father was not well or had a bad throat, he'd say, come on, you do it now. You know what I said? Over here, over there. I couldn't do it. I was too shy to do it. And I spent the rest of my life wanting to do that, wanting to be my father, wanting to write the literature that my mother loved so much, but also wanting to do what my father did to large crowds. And I never really got to be a market man until I went to teach at Sydney University in 1964, my first job, and I sold the classics to 700 or 800 Sydney University students at a time. It's your Middlemarch. I'm not asking, or it's your Tess of the D'Urbervilles. And at last I was my father. They stared at me as though I was mad.
Cheap at half the price, Tess of the D'Urbervilles. And you did, even as a young man, have other arenas for glory. How did table tennis enter your life?
Table tennis is the shy boy's retreat. It's because it's you get very internalized and introverted when you play table tennis, and you think about nothing else. And my mother wanted me to play table tennis because she thought it was safe, because it wasn't one of those great big balls which when you head, you get very, very, I mean, my mother knew then that if you head a ball, you'd be very ill in later life. It's now been proved to be right. She thought football was dangerous. I thought football was dangerous. I didn't like playing cricket because the ball was very hard, and if that ball, it's all about avoiding being hurt. What game was there that I could play that had a ball that couldn't hurt you? Table tennis. Table tennis ball can't hurt. In fact, if you get a table tennis ball in, I knew someone who'd been blinded by a table tennis ball, but I didn't mention that to my mother. Didn't think she'd want to know any of that. But table tennis then became, for a while, the focus of all my dreams. I became quite good. I played for Manchester, then I played for Lancashire. I even had a trial as a boy. Didn't make it, but I got to be something like number 8 or 9 ranked junior player in the country. Junior player, mind you, that's not very good, but nonetheless, I could play the game quite well. And I dreamed of being a world champion. I thought it could happen. I thought I had the game for it. And I thought that being a world champion table tennis player would attract to me a small fortune, no, a large fortune actually, and the attention of beautiful women. I've since found that if you ask beautiful women who their favorite table tennis player is, very few can answer. In fact, you might try a straw poll with your audience now. Name your 10 favorite table tennis players. So the whole thing, and then I wrote a novel about this called The Mighty Waltzer. But it sort of my 13th to my 16th year, that was something that, apart from literature, occupied my whole time. It was good for me. I had a tracksuit, I had shorts, I went training, I skipped like a boxer. Anybody seeing me in my garden would have thought, if this boy didn't look so pathetic and weedy and shy and hopeless, he could be training to be a boxer. In fact, I was training to be the world's greatest table tennis player, and I failed.
If only we'd been speaking to Howard Jacobson, the Olympian table tennis player, instead of Howard Jacobson, the Booker winner novelist. Well, another life.
You wouldn't have had a hall big enough to welcome.
So you have these competing urges or twin urges as a young man of the glory of table tennis, the glory of literature. What did your parents want for you? What were their hopes, or maybe more precisely, what were their fears for you as you entered early adulthood?
My mother wanted me, they both wanted me to be English. That was as strong, as English as possible. All my friends' parents were the same. That generation of boys born in the 40s whose parents had either come over themselves from Poland and Lithuania, or whose parents had come over, and whose parents spoke to them in Yiddish. There was that feeling that we had to get rid of all that Eastern European stuff and become English. Go to university and become English. And we were encouraged to do that. My mother could see that I liked books and things, and she encouraged me to do that. My father's fear for me, my father never read a book, but that was fine. If that's what I wanted to do, that was fine. Didn't understand what it was all about, but if that was what I wanted to do, fine. His fear for me was that my mother had made a softie of me, feminized me, made me a milksop, which she had, which in truth she had. And he also felt that I was not, he didn't want me to be a sporting, he wasn't interested in sport, though he did buy boxing gloves once and bought boxing gloves for me, and we sparred together in the garden and he knocked me out. And my mother had to explain to him that fathers are not meant to knock their 4-year-old sons out in the garden. But he didn't care whether I played cricket or football. He wanted me to be, what's the phrase I'm looking for? Not sportsman, to be a good sport. He wanted me to be a good sport, to be able to take jokes against myself, not to wander around with a long face all the time, not to be such a misery, just to laugh at life and enjoy life as he did. And he never quite got to see that, unfortunately.
How did your mother react the morning you received a telegram from Cambridge University offering you a place?
I was in bed late, and she brought the envelope up and handed it to me. And I looked and I said, I'm in, I've got a place at Cambridge. She went very, very still. And she said, can I just see that envelope? And she looked at the envelope. She said, I just want to check it's for you. Now, this was not because she thought I was undeserving of a place at university. Indeed, she thought I was deserving of all the places at university that were on offer. But what she feared was that something had gone wrong and that I would therefore be disappointed. The great concern of her life was that none of her children ever be disappointed. And she saw that as her job, and she took it extremely seriously. We must not be disappointed. This was a deeply loving thing, but also a very inhibiting thing, because part of her instinct was to stop us trying for anything too hard in case we failed. When you have a parent that doesn't want you to fail, that parent is also not going to encourage you to try hard enough at different things. And that was a double-edged side to my mother's affection, which went on through. I always felt that she'd always said, you could do anything, and then the implication was, but don't try.
It was your dad who drove you to Piccadilly Station on the morning that you left for university. What happened as you said goodbye?
My father was he was not financially competent. He was not competent as a businessman at all, but he was socially very, very assured and competent. And he was always helping people out of fixes. And he was always, in driving up and down from the markets, we had this accursed earplug has fallen out. We were on the road a lot, and it seems to me that almost every week there was an accident that my father saw that nobody else had seen. One incident stands out in my mind of my father pulling into the hard shoulder, we didn't call it hard shoulder then, pulling off the East Lancashire Road between Liverpool and Manchester and saying, you stay here, and him tearing out through the traffic because he'd seen a car on a field on its back with its wheels spinning and smoke coming out. And there he was, and I could see from the car him ripping open, with very strong man, ripping open with his bare hands the cars and pulling people out. That was the kind, if there was a house on fire, my father would be passing and he'd run up and rescue people. He just did all that. He did all he fixed cars, he repaired things. He was a totally capable man, which meant that I was a totally incapable boy. And I thought, at last, I'm off to Cambridge. I'm now in charge of my own life. That's it. I am now a man on my own account. And my father can't show me up by being more of a man. He takes me and he suddenly becomes a kind of butler to me. It upset me, really. I'll take your luggage. And he was like, now I was off to Cambridge. He was my valet. And he put my luggage up on the luggage rack, settle me down, and that embarrassed me the way he did. Settle me down, said, I'll find you a seat, found me a seat opposite this guy who was in railway uniform and sleeping in the corner of the seat. You'll be all right here. So we shook hands. We didn't do any hugging in there. There was no such thing as hugging in those days. There was a lot of punching. Punch me on the shoulder and do all that, which I took to be fatherly affection. I punched him back. We've done a lot of punching together. If I make it sound as though my father had done nothing but punch me, that's almost true. But never, seldom viciously. And just as the train was about to go off, he went, stop, stop. And he ran out on the platform and screamed, stop the train, then ran back into the compartment, said, come on, you're coming off. I said, what's going on? What's happening? The man he'd sat me opposite was dead. He'd sat me opposite a corpse. He'd looked a little green. I'd spotted that, but that he would be dead, I did. And he then controlled everything. He kind of got the man off. He dealt with the police. I thought, had the driver of the train been in shock, my father would have driven it all the way to Cambridge. And once he'd sorted everything out, then he actually blew the whistle to get the train off again. I thought, even at this moment, even at my moment, at last, to be independent and to be a man, my father is running the whole thing.
I picture you sitting there clutching that roll of toilet paper to your chest as all of this was going on about you. How do you remember your time at Cambridge? Were they golden years for you?
No, I hated Cambridge. I didn't know what to do with it. I was a shy boy, as I've told you, and I was an alienated boy. I didn't know where I belonged. And then I went to study English with somebody who also didn't really belong. So I was doubly alienated, even to the point of turning alienation into a kind of bit of a cult. I was with a group of boys, all of us not well-to-do grammar school boys who rather liked this F.R. Leavis, our teacher of English, and we stepped out of the mainstream of Cambridge life. We certainly had nothing to do with the people who played rugger and rowers and things like that. So we were we were a group. I was a little group of one within a group of about 10, and we multiplied shyness. Our teachers were shy. Nobody knew how to look at one another. The most embarrassing thing was to run into someone who taught you and say good morning to them on the street. They didn't know how to look. I didn't know how to look. It was excruciating. I had 3 entirely excruciating years. I hated every minute of being a Cambridge.
You keep saying that you were a shy boy, but was there also some part of your nature that you were dampening down in those years, that you were keeping a check on?
I certainly felt there was a part of my nature that was not being able to express itself, but I didn't quite know where it was. The only time I discovered it was when I gave a speech at my bar mitzvah, and I thought, I like this. I enjoy this. I like the fact of being able to make the crowd laugh a bit, and I thought that's something I could do. And then I went on at school and liked debating and things. And as long as I had the floor, as long as someone would say to me, okay, Howard, it's now your turn to talk. The floor belongs to you by right. As long as I was entitled to address an audience, I could have addressed an audience of millions. But had I not, and this is still the same today, had I been a guest at somebody else's talk and someone had picked on me and from the stage and said, oh, look, there's Howard Jacobson, I would have died. And I still dread being picked on when I go. I still dread going to for some people it's like pantomime. When you're a little boy and the actors at the pantomime call you up. Come on, all the kids up onto the stage. And my father would push me, get up. No, I don't want to go on. No. So I grew up fearing that everybody on the stage could see me. No matter where I sat, they could see me. So when I was able to choose where I sat on my own, I would always sit as far back as possible. And to this day, even, I'm not convinced if I go to an opera or even a ballet that they're not going to call me out. Swan Lake isn't going to stop, and they're not going to say, there's Howard Jacobson. Howard, come up. Let's see you dance. Come up.
You did fall in love during your time at Cambridge with a woman that you'd met on a trip home to Manchester. Her name was Barbara. What concern did your parents have about Barbara?
Well, they liked Barbara. They thought Barbara was good fun. She was good fun. She was very nice to look at. She was taller than me. I liked women. In those days, I thought the sign that you'd done well romantically was to have a girlfriend who was taller than you. Don't ask me why this was, but I would go out searching for women taller than me. They're not very hard to find, I have to tell you. But nonetheless, when I found one, I thought, that's it, bingo. They thought she was charming. The problem was, although she was an entirely Jewish girl, and they needed that, they had very little interest in Jewishness, my parents, except for this one thing: I had to marry in. Must never, ever marry out. And you can never get to the bottom of it. I'd say, what's so terrible about marrying out? If you marry out, that's the end. Hitler wins. You marry out, Hitler wins. The idea that Hitler was nothing else on his mind but whether, leaving aside the fact that he was dead, the idea that if Howard Jacobson marries out, I've won. We've won. Howard's married out. What's so important about this? What is this Jewishness we're preserving, Dad? He didn't have a clue. He didn't go to shul. He didn't know anything about Jewishness at all. And he'd say, well, Jewish is where you marry in. So I said, so you're saying I've got to marry out because if I don't marry out, I've ruined the principle of marrying in? He'd go, yeah, that's pretty well it. What made Barbara a difficult choice, although she was entirely Jewish, was that she wasn't. Because she had one Jewish parent and one non-Jewish parent, and they were the wrong ones. She had a Jewish father and she had a non-Jewish mother. A non-Jewish mother was entirely Jewish, but she was called Mary Flanagan. Tricky that. So we had to have her, as we said, I think the word was Magayed. She had to be Magayed. She had to be made Jewish according to, and I get confused here about what's Reform and what's liberal. But according to one of those, in order for us to be married in a Reform or a liberal synagogue, Barbara had to be made Jewish. And for that, she had to be given lessons. She had a sister who was in the same position. And so they decided they would Magay the whole family, cut price. We'll do the whole family. Not 100 quid, not 50 quid the lot, we'll make the whole family Jewish. So the whole family was made Jewish. It was very primitive. They had to read the book of Genesis, and then they'd go up before a tribunal of 3 Reform, or was it liberal rabbis, who would ask them various questions to test their Jew. But the questions were like, who married Eve? Now, no disrespect, but they failed this test about 3 times. And eventually they decided that if they could make the questions easier, they would get through. And at last they got through, and Barbara was Jewish enough to satisfy my parents, and indeed to satisfy hers, because they wanted her to be a full Jewish girl too. So we were able to have one of those nice Jewish Reform or liberal weddings in which 200 people you don't know come, and they all give you a check. And at the end of the evening, you have an inside pocket bulging with checks from uncles you didn't know you had. And Barbara I took to Australia. We'd only been married about 3 or 4 months, and we went to Australia together.
How did your family and friends react to this news that you were heading to Australia?
My parents were very frightened. They thought they would never see us again. Even my father, who was not given to emotionalism, was upset. And he saw us off again. I thought, oh God, if he sees us off again on the boat train, he's going to sit us next to a dead person. But what he did do, my father, was he bought a cine camera. He was very into, it's called cine camera then, not a video, a cine camera. And with this cine camera, we were meant to film, because we went to Australia by boat, and we were meant to film the voyage. And then we could send the films back, and our families, Barbara's family, my family, could all get together and watch the film. And my father said, I'm going to edit this film, and to make this film right, I need to film you leaving on the train. So I said, if you're filming us leaving on the train, how do we then get he said, leave it to me. So the last sight of my father at that time was of him running after the train with the cine camera to catch us, and we had to lean out the window waving. And he's filming us, and I said, Dad, quick! He was a strong but a little man, tiny little legs. So when he ran, he had to move very, very quickly. And finally, he just couldn't catch us to get the cine camera back. So he threw it. And I leaned out of the window. I'd been no good at sports. And I leaned out of the window and I caught it. And at the moment of catching it, I thought, you know, maybe I could have been a footballer after all.
What did Sydney look like to a young lad from Manchester?
I'm just losing your sound a bit.
What did Sydney look like to a young lad from Manchester?
The most beautiful thing I had ever seen in my life, and still recall, how many years is it? It's a half a century ago, more. Sailing through the Heads on the SS Oriana P&O ship. And just sailing through the Heads is a thing of beauty. It was a hot afternoon, hotter than anything I'd ever seen. Remember, I came from Manchester where it rained every day, and then I lived in Cambridge where it was cold every day. And I suddenly came, and this was a weather that I knew nothing of, a blue sky. What's that? I said to Barbara, what's that there? She said, that's sky, darling. And I said, and what's that thing in the sky? She said, that's sun, darling. I said, are we going to have this the whole time we're here? She said, well, I don't know, but with a bit of luck. And we did have it the whole time we were there. And there was the bridge, that most beautiful bridge, that staggering bridge. There was no opera house yet, though I was to watch from late. The opera house was being built while we were there. I watched the opera house be built. And we sailed into the Heads. And there were thousands of little ships waving us in. Boats were very emotional then. The leaving Southampton had been hugely emotional, playing the Rule Britannia and playing Waltzing Matilda and all that. And people used to knot, I don't know whether you've ever saw any of that or read about it, people would knot stockings together. And you'd have thousands of stockings, and you'd eat, the family you were saying goodbye to would have one end, and the people on land would have another. And as the boat moved out, the stockings would stretch and stretch and stretch until they snapped. And that snap was a symbolic, that was that, they'd gone. And in those days you thought if people went to Australia, you might never see them again. And it was coming back was similar. People were there on the quay welcoming members of the family they'd not seen before. And I didn't have family, but I had an old friend from Cambridge and Sydney English department. And there was Sydney English department waiting for me on the quay. And you can always tell an English department, something about the way an English department dresses. I knew that was Sydney English. I knew from the kind of sandals they wore, from the fact that they were wearing socks in their sandals, from the fact that their shorts were too long, from the fact that their skin was pale. I knew that's the Sydney English department.
How did living in this beautiful, sunny place on the other side of the world change you?
It let me be, I suppose, put it crudely, it let me be my father. Everything vanished. My inhibitions seemed to vanish. How that was, I don't know. Was it the weather cheered me up? Was it the fact that I finally had a job? I couldn't believe it, for example, when I got into Sydney, into the university building and saw I had a plaque. I've still got that, I've kept it. A wooden plaque with gold lettering, Howard Jacobson, lecturer. That's it. I now know who I am. I'm a lecturer. I have a job. Excuse me. And I felt I was somebody. I had arrived. I was somebody. I liked Australians. I got on with them. They were sort of confident, extra confident versions of Mancunians. They reminded me of Mancunians. They didn't remind me of the people I'd met in Cambridge. They reminded me of Mancunians. They had a dry sense of humor, even drier sense of humor than the people in Manchester. There was I didn't feel, although I'd never been deeply troubled by anti-Semitism, there was always a feeling the country was not quite yours. England was not quite yours. You go to Australia and you felt, I had no reason to feel Australia was mine. Who was I to feel Australia was mine? But I didn't feel it wasn't mine or that it was against me. It was a country that was used to the idea of people coming from all over, and I was just one of them. I felt welcomed there, and I felt I was able to say be myself is corny, because I didn't know who myself was. I was able to find a version of me that I liked more than I've ever liked any version of me. I still feel that. I still feel I was, if I've improved from the moping, miserable little boy I was, and then the undergraduate I was, I do believe I owe that to Australia, Sydney, and then later on Melbourne. But initially, Sydney gave me that.
You had this period of your life in Sydney and Melbourne where you were struggling to write this novel that wasn't quite working, and your relationship with Barbara came to an end, and then you found yourself back in the UK in a place called Wolverhampton. For those of us who have not had the pleasure, Howard, what kind of place is Wolverhampton?
Well, first of all, let me say that nobody who has been to Wolverhampton should make sure that they get there. Book yourself a passage, get there. Now's a good time to come. Leaves on the trees. Are there trees in Wolverhampton? There must have been trees in Wolverhampton. What Wolverhampton did was I left Sydney for all sorts of reasons, and with it, the job. And then I never got the equivalent to that Sydney lectureship again. I'd not done the kind of work, I'd not done the academic work you're meant to do when you're a young lecturer to make sure that you move up the next stage. I hadn't published learned articles. I hadn't. Just a minute. I hadn't done research. I hadn't studied for a PhD while I was teaching. I wasn't ready to move on to the next. I felt I was ready, but other universities didn't think I was ready to be given a job. So I got no job. And for many years, I was in the wilderness. I went many years. Wolverhampton is a good 7 or 8 years after I'd left Sydney and been back to Melbourne, come back to England again, nothing being written. And I felt this was the final indignity, really, that I'd spiraled all the way down from this lectureship at Sydney into not being able to get a job, doing bits of part-time teaching at Cambridge, which had a bit of clout. Sounded all right, what are you doing? I'm teaching at Cambridge. Had they known the reality, I earned so little money teaching at Cambridge that I had to run a market store. I was back running a market store, selling late travel goods, until I could bear that no more. Went back to Melbourne, came back from Melbourne, finally was offered a job at Wolverhampton. And Wolverhampton is in the West Midlands. It's an industrial town in the West Midlands. It's very, very unglamorous. The very name sounds unglamorous, Wolverhampton. There is a local West Midlands accent, which is the most mournful, miserable, dank accent you've ever heard. And I found myself teaching I was a snob. I was teaching at a polytechnic. I'd been to Cambridge. I taught at Sydney University. There was only one place for that after me, and that was either Princeton or Harvard or somewhere like that, or a chair at Oxford. Not only did none of those things happen, I'm at Wolverhampton. I am ashamed of how ashamed I was of Wolverhampton. I was really ashamed to be there. But the one good thing for that was it so depressed me that I finally had to write. I finally found my subject, which was utter depression, utter dejection, all the rest had been a charade. This was dejection and shame. This was uber dejection. This was noch dejection and shame. I finally got there. My promised land, a lectureship at Wolverhampton Polytechnic, and I was able to write out of that dismalness, really, out of that total and complete. I should not have felt that. What was wrong with teaching at a Polytechnic? Well, what was wrong with teaching at a Polytechnic? There were kids there who wanted to. Why did I hate it so much? Well, that's one of the things that I wrote this book to think about.
I think it's fair to say that romantically things were not smooth sailing for you in these years either. You had got together with Roz, a woman you first met when she tried to have you thrown out of a women's literature conference in Lorne. She wasn't too impressed by Wolverhampton. Where did Roz move to while you were together?
To begin with, although I met Roz in Melbourne, we linked up again when she came to England on one of those trips that Australians were doing in those days. And she had nothing much to do and she had nowhere to go, really. She was at a loose end. I thought, hello. And she was taller than me. This was very important. I thought, yes, I'll take her to Wolverhampton. And she said, Wolverhampton, that sounds a nice place. I thought, if I can conceal what the place looks like from her. She might even kind of settle in, not just live with me, but live with me forever in Wolverhampton. Who knows? I'm a romantic man. I'm a marrying man. I thought, yeah, we'd get married and we'd live in Wolverhampton for the rest of our lives. And she'd make Wolverhampton not so terrible. As long as I was able to find a way of never letting her go out to see what Wolverhampton actually looked like. But in fact, trying to keep her in was even worse because I lived in the most dismal, miserable flat. I'm a masochist, so once I realized that Wolverhampton was miserable, I thought I'll make it as miserable as I possibly can, really publish. So I lived in this cheap, grotty flat. I shared a bathroom. I'm very fastidious around all that. I've been brought up by my mother, the reason my mother wanted me to take toilet rolls to Cambridge was not just because Cambridge might not have had any, but she wanted me to have my own toilet rolls. She didn't want me to go near a toilet roll that had been touched or breathed on or looked at by another person. And yet here I am sharing a toilet with God knows how many other people in this disgusting flat that didn't have hot water. It was a cold water flat. So Ros came and took a look at that. And with admirable Australian energy, she cleaned the place up. She took the carpet out of the bathroom. She said, there's a way, let me just show you, she said, how you know when a carpet is finished. And that's when you take it off the floor and you can wring it out. That's a carpet you don't want to be walking on. So she put a new carpet in the bathroom. She cleaned up she wasn't able to sort out the cold water problem. She got me out of my suits because I always used to wear a little black suit and a waistcoat in those days. Don't ask me why, like somebody out of H.G. Wells. And I would sit in my flat on the edge of a chair. And she'd say, why are you dressed in a suit? And I'd say, because suits, they suit me. She said, well, we'll fix you. We'll fix you. And she got me into Cuban heels to make me a little bit. Cuban heels didn't exist that would make me tall enough to be the same height as her, but they reduced the disparity between us. And she would say, now, why are you sitting on the edge of your chair as though you mean to be, you're going to go away in a minute? You're in flight. Are you in flight? I said, of course I'm in flight. She wasn't Jewish, otherwise she would have known why I was sitting on the edge of the chair in a suit with my suitcases packed. I'd left that out. So I had to explain to her the emotional and actual history of being Jewish, that you never know when the Cossacks are coming. She said there are no Cossacks. This was how ignorant she was this was in the nicest possible way, but Australians come to England and they don't know to Europe, they don't know what they're saying. She thought there were no Cossacks or Nazis in Wolverhampton. How dumb can you be? But anyway, she got me out of my suit and she persuaded me that maybe if they were going to chase me out of Wolverhampton, well, maybe that I should enjoy that because I didn't like being there anyway. She grew very quickly. After about a month, she realized Wolverhampton was not for her. And on a holiday in Cornwall, she fell for this little village called Boscastle. And she said, if we are to beat it, there's two things couples do after about a month together when they're not really happy. You can have a kid. Well, we decided we didn't do that, or you can move house. So she moved house, and she got a little elfin cottage in Boscastle. Fell in love, I thought naively, with all these Cornish ways. This was a Cornish village where they have witches, and hippies and things, and I had no taste for that. She had a big taste for that. She loved all that. So she lived in Cornwall, I lived in Wolverhampton, and I just drove from Wolverhampton to Cornwall, there and back. Not every day, but certainly every week, there and back, clocking up thousands and thousands of miles. And there, yet again, I'm drawn into small retail. She opens a little craft shop. Not a gift shop, a craft shop. So whenever I tried to stock it with the kind of swag that my father had sold, she got furious because she was selling much more beautiful objects than that. And we lived there on and off for many years. We got married. I think one of my best chapters in this book, I should say. I've forgotten that I'm talking about a book where all this is related. One of the best chapters, I think, is our honeymoon, which we both agreed, in a very friendly, amicable way, was the worst honeymoon any two people had ever. Well, any people had ever had our honeymoon in Paris. It was my second honeymoon in Paris. My first wife and I had gone to Paris. That had not been a very good honeymoon anyway. I honeymooned very badly in Paris. And And only the other day I said to my wife, my third wife, my beloved wife, and my final wife, and I said, she said, let's go, we need a break, let's go somewhere. I said, Paris? She said, no, not, you must never, ever go to Paris. Because Paris is a place of disappointment. All the things that, for me, it's the perfect place to go to be miserable, because all the things you think that are going to happen in Paris, for me, never ever happen. I've never had a good meal in Paris. I've never found a good restaurant in Paris, never. I've never seen Paris is supposed to be full of elegant men and beautifully dressed. I've never seen any of that. I've just walked through Paris looking for somewhere to have a coffee, can't find anywhere to have a coffee. And one dream of mine that Paris was meant to realize was, and this has been a dream earlier of mine, that I would, once I became a writer, and I was now well on the way to being, because of Wolverhampton, I was writing about it, well on the way to being a writer. When we got to Paris, I thought that was my chance to have that Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, sitting out at tables, drinking Pernod, making cigarettes, conversation with other writers. Well, I didn't know anyone in Paris to have conversation with. Ros didn't want to have those. I said, you can be Simone de Beauvoir. You be Simone de Beauvoir. I'll be Jean-Paul Sartre. Once you've said that, once you've agreed you're going to be Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, it doesn't work. As it turned out, I should have said that the nearest I've ever got to having that Parisian intellectual life on the streets was Melbourne. I'm not saying this to schmooze your audience. I mean, I know enough people in Melbourne to know I can't get away with that. But in my years, just to go back a bit, in my years, and I talk about this in the memoir, in my years in Melbourne, in Carlton in particularly, which I loved Carlton. I never thought I would enjoy living in Melbourne after Sydney, but I did once I saw Carlton. And I did have that life. It was almost like being Jean-Paul Sartre and lots of Simone de Beauvoirs there, sitting out on not Lygon, was it what was the one with all the little, Drummond Street, was it? Anyway.
But we're not, I'm going to move us along, Howard, only because I'm aware that the time is ticking. You still haven't written a novel.
But I'm just enjoying talking
I know,
about
but we
Melbourne
need to reach cathartic culmination with this, that you, out of the torturous depths of this honeymoon, did sit down and write this novel about, the depressive novel about Wolverhampton Polytechnic, and you gave it to Ros to read. What was her reaction?
I gave her about 200 pages of manuscript, and she sat quiet. She said, don't be near me when I'm reading. I don't want you in the room. Just go out and bring me bottles of wine. We got through a lot of bottles of red wine. She was an Australian. She drank a lot of wine. I had been Australianized. I drank a lot of wine. Together, we could get through bottles. And in fact, we drank more. When we first met, I couldn't afford the wine that we drank. My salary didn't cover our wine bill. So I'd go out and bring her bottles of red wine, usually Australian wine, which she'd then consume while reading my manuscript. But I'd listen from another room. And I didn't hear any laughing. I thought I'd written a very, very funny. She was an odd reader in that she didn't laugh when she read. The only time I ever heard her laughing when she read a novel was Philip Roth, and I got furious with it. That was years later. I got furious with it. I said, I don't mind you reading another person, because I'm a modern husband. I don't mind, absolutely liberated modern husband. As far as I'm concerned, my wife can read whatever she wants to read. Absolutely free. But she mustn't laugh at another man's writing, because to laugh at somebody's writing, that's very intimate. Because when you laugh, your face goes red, you show your throat. Laugh is a flirtation. Laughter is flirtatious, which is one of the reasons I've always liked to make people laugh as a writer myself. It is a form, it is the higher flirtation to make. And she wasn't laughing at this. She wasn't laughing. And every now and then I'd say, "Is everything all right?" Because I don't hear any laughter. She said, "You don't hear any laughter because nothing's funny." I thought, well, this is not. She was a straight talking. I thought, this is not going well. Anyway, finally, she kind of called me in. Okay, I've finished. And she pointed to a page and she said, your novel starts here. 200-page manuscript I've given her. And she pointed to page 199. And she said, the novel starts here. I said, well, what do I do with the rest of the early stuff? She said, chuck it. And I said, well, what is it about? She said, I don't know. It starts here. The novel starts here. You're the writer. You think you're the writer. You decide. And I looked and I looked and I looked, and I think without her knowing it, this is not for her, maybe she did know it, but what she'd seen was the novel this novel of disappointment about Wolverhampton had just become Jewish. It hadn't meant to be Jewish, but it'd just become Jewish. The biggest joke of all being that this person hating his life in Wolverhampton was a Jew with grand ambitions, a Jew to whom God has said, you will be serious, I choose you, you have an important function, an important role in life, go out and be serious. And this Jew who'd been given this grand mission in life, as all Jews are given this grand mission in life, was teaching in Wolverhampton Polytechnic. And not only that, but in the football ground. The English department was teaching in the football stand of Wolverhampton Polytechnic. So I just saw that, suddenly I'd just seen on page 199 that what made this humiliation complete was to make the hero Jewish. I hadn't realized he would be Jewish. On page 199, he became Jewish. Once I knew he was Jewish, the novel kind of wrote itself.
What did your father say about the fact that you dedicated this, your first novel, once it was published, to him and your mother?
It was heartbreaking. He thought I'd gone out and got it printed specially. He didn't know that the book comes with, that the dedication in the book is what is like the text of a book. It's how the book is printed. He thought I'd got the book from my publishers. They wouldn't have known what a publisher was, and I'd gone out to the place where you get your bar mitzvah invitations and wedding invitations printed. Shmuley Steinberg, I think, was the person who did the printing. Gone there and said, put to my mother, and he thought I'd spent a little bit of extra money and did that, and he thought, that's very kind of you, Howard. That's very, very nice. And it kind of touched me that he had not a clue. He was here was I, the most bookish person alive, although I'd only just written one, but steeped in books, buying books, collecting books, loving books, and there was my father who didn't have the most basic sense of what a book was. It made me shed a tear for him.
Howard, I'm very sad that you're not here in person, but given some of the tales you've told us, perhaps it's safer that you're on the other side of a Zoom call. Though if you were here, I'd like to see you in a massive romper suit, a giant adult Howard Jacobson baby grow.
No, you wouldn't. Trust me, you wouldn't.
It has been a delight. Please, everyone, join me in thanking Howard Jacobson.
I wish I was there. I really, truly wish I was there. I would love to be there.
And they will all rush off and buy your book now, and I'll sign it for you, Howard.
Put it this way, if they buy enough of them, I'll come over and sign.
All right.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for letting us go a little bit longer. That was just a delight. As you could tell from Howard, we could have been here till tomorrow morning, but the stories that we've just touched on are elaborated in a really wonderful memoir. I can't recommend it highly enough. And this will be broadcast on Conversations in a week or two, so you can listen all over again. Thank you. Thank you, Howard. Have a lovely Sunday.
Thank you, Sarah. You too. All the best. Bye-bye.